The Sack and Destruction of the City of Columbia, South Carolina, by William Gilmore Simms, to which is added a list of the property destroyed. Columbia, South Carolina, the Power Press of the Daily Phoenix, 1865. Home Sweet Home. A correspondent of the Augusta Constitutionalist states that a young lady whose house was destroyed and burned by Sherman's army while at Columbia, a day or two after the conflagration, visited the ruins in hopes of finding some little relic to remind her of the trials through which she had passed. She searched in vain until her eye fell on a small piece of paper, which she picked up. It proved to be a remnant of John Howard Payne's song of Home, Sweet Home, and the only words that were left untouched by the flames were, "There is no place like home." Not one little relic, not a souvenir left, of all that she loved by the mad flames bereft. The ruins all blackened loom up on the sky, and the south wind sings softly their sad lullaby. She looks here, she looks there for one little thing, a letter, a trinket, a riband or ring. Perchance there may be mid the rubbish and dust the miniature features of him she loved first. No, nothing. The flames in their savage career have swallowed up all that her heart holds most dear. Of her once happy home not a vestige is seen, and the still wind now moans through the crimped evergreen. A slip of white paper lay trembling alone amid the charred timber and smoke-blackened stone. Like a snowflake on Hecla, it shone in the light, or a pearl that was set in the dark brow of night. The lady took up the lone slip from the ground, and gazing upon its white surface she found these 6 little words, as if traced by some gnome to mock her deep grief: "There is no place like home." I sing of sweet home mid the ashes and smoke. 'Twas blessed till the spoiler its wailings awoke. 'Twas happy till Northmen, with wild fiendish hate, gave towns to the flames, and made fields desolate. J.H.H. Chapter 1. Introduction. It has pleased God, in that providence which is so inscrutable to man, to visit our beautiful city with the most cruel fate which can ever befall states or cities. He has permitted an invading army to penetrate our country almost without impediment, to rob and ravage our dwellings, and to commit 3/5 of our city to the flames. 84 squares out of 124, which the city contains, have been destroyed, with scarcely the exception of a single house. The ancient Capitol building of the state, that venerable structure which for 70 years has echoed with the eloquence and wisdom of the most famous statesman, is laid in ashes. 6 temples of the Most High God have shared the same fate. 11 banking establishments, the schools of learning, the shops of art and trade, of invention and manufacture, shrines equally of religion, benevolence, and industry, are all buried together in one congregated ruin. Humiliation spreads her ashes over our homes and garments, and the universal wreck exhibits only one common aspect of despair. It is for us, as succinctly but as fully as possible, and in the simplest language, to endeavor to make the melancholy record of our wretchedness as complete as possible. Chapter 2. Fatal Blunder. Removal of General Johnston from command of the Confederate Army. When, by a crime no less than blunder, General Johnston was removed from the command of the Confederate armies in Georgia, which he had conducted with such signal ability, there were not a few of our citizens who felt the impending danger, and trembled at the disastrous consequences which they partly foresaw. The removal of a general so fully in the confidence of his troops, who had so long baffled the conquests, if he could not arrest the march of the opposing army, was of itself a proceeding to startle the thoughtful mind. General Sherman declared his satisfaction at the event, and on repeated occasions since has expressed himself to the same effect. He was emboldened by the change, and almost instantly after, his successes became rapid and of the most decided character. General Johnston was, by nature, no less than training and education, the very best of the Confederate generals to be opposed to General Sherman. To the nervo-sanguine temperament, eager and impetuous of the latter, he opposed a moral and physical nature, calm, sedate, circumspect, cool, vigilant, and wary, always patient and watchful of his moment, never rash or precipitate, but ever firm and decisive, his resources all regulated by a self-possessed will, and a mind in full possession of that military coup d'oeil which, grasping the remotest relations of the field, is probably the very first essential to a general having the control of a large and various army. The error which took Hood into the colder regions of Tennessee at the beginning of the winter was one which the Yankee general was slow to imitate, especially as, in so moving, Hood necessarily left all the doors wide open which conducted to the seaboard. It required no great effort of genius to prompt the former to take the pathways which were thus laid open to him. Even had he not already conceived the propriety of forcing his way to the Atlantic coast, and to a junction with his shipping, the policy of then doing so would have been forced upon him by the proceeding of his rival, and by the patent fact that there were no impediments to such a progress. We had neither army nor general ready to impede his march. It suggested itself. The facility of such a progress was clear enough, and, with that quickness of decision which distinguishes the temperament of Sherman, he at once rushed into the open pathway. The hasty levies of regular troops, collected by Hardee, and the clans of scattered militia, gathered with great difficulty and untrained to service, were rather calculated to provoke his enterprise than to impede his march, and, laying waste as he went, after a series of small and unimportant skirmishes, he made his way to the coast, made himself master of Savannah, and from the banks of that river, beheld opened before him all the avenues into and through South Carolina. It is understood that Hardee had in hand to oppose this progress something less than 10,000 men, while the force of Sherman was, in round numbers, something like 50,000, of which 33,000 consisted of infantry, the rest of artillery and cavalry. Chapter 3. Terrible Forebodings. Sherman's March through Georgia. The destruction of Atlanta, the pillaging and burning of other towns of Georgia, and the subsequent devastation along the march of the Federal army through Georgia gave sufficient earnest of the treatment to be anticipated by South Carolina, should the same commander be permitted to make a like progress in our state. The Northern press furnished him with the cry de guerre to be sounded when he should cross our borders. Voe victis! Woe to the conquered! In the case of a people who had first raised the banner of secession, the howl of delight, such was the language of the Northern press, sent up by Sherman's legions when they looked across the Savannah to the shores of Carolina, was the sure forerunner of the terrible fate which threatened our people should the soldiers at once be let loose upon our lands. Our people felt all the danger. They felt that it required the first abilities, the most strenuous exertions, the most prompt and efficient reinforcements to prevent the threatening catastrophe. Hardee, though of acknowledged ability and considered able as the leader of a corps, was not the man to grasp the business of a large army. All eyes looked to General Johnston as the one man, next to Lee, to whom the duty should be confided and the trust. It was confidently hoped and believed that he would be restored to the command, and that adequate reinforcements would be furnished. At all events, no one doubted that, with adequate supplies of men and materiel, Johnston would most effectually arrest the further progress of Sherman's army. Applications of the most urgent entreaty were addressed by our delegates and leading men in the Confederate Congress to President Davis, urging these objects. But he declined to restore the commander whom he had so greatly wronged, and in respect to reinforcements, these were too tardily furnished, and in too small number to avail much in offering requisite resistance. The reinforcements did not make their appearance in due season for the concentration of the strength at any one point, and opposition to Sherman everywhere consisted of little more than a series of small skirmishes, without result on either side. No pass was held with any tenacity, no battle fought. Sherman was allowed to travel 150 miles of our state, through a region of swamp and thicket, in no portion of which could a field be found adequate to the display of 10,000 men, where, under good partisan leaders, the Federals might have been cut off in separate bodies, their supplies stopped, their march constantly embarrassed by hard fighting, and where, a bloody toll exacted at every defile, they must have found a Thermopylae of every 5 miles of their march. The Confederates had no partisan fighting, as in days of old. They had a system which insisted upon artillery as paramount, insisted upon arbitrary lines for defense, chosen without any regard to the topography of the country. "We will make a stand," said the Confederate chiefs, "at this river crossing, or that, then fall back to the next river, and so on to the last." Although in 1,000 places of dense swamp, narrow defile, and almost impenetrable thicket between these rivers, it would have been easy to find spots where 300 men under competent commanders who knew the country might most effectually have baffled 3,000. Chapter 4. Sherman's entrance into South Carolina. Destruction of property in the Low Country. The march of the Federals into our state was characterized by such scenes of license, plunder, and general conflagration as very soon showed that the threats of the Northern press and of their soldiery were not to be regarded as mere brutum fulmen. Day by day brought to the people of Columbia tidings of atrocities committed, and more extended progress. Daily did long trains of fugitives line the roads with wives and children, and horses and stock and cattle, seeking refuge from the pursuers. Long lines of wagons covered the highways. Half-naked people cowered from the winter under bush tents in the thickets, under the eaves of houses, under the railroad sheds, and in old cars left them along the route. All these repeated the same story of suffering, violence, poverty, and nakedness. Habitation after habitation, village after village, one sending up its signal flames to the other, presaging for it the same fate, lighted the winter and midnight sky with crimson horrors. No language can describe, nor can any catalogue furnish, an adequate detail of the widespread destruction of homes and property. Granaries were emptied, and where the grain was not carried off, it was strewn to waste under the feet of cavalry, or consigned to the fire which consumed the dwelling. The negroes were robbed equally with the whites of food and clothing. The roads were covered with butchered cattle, hogs, mules, and the costliest furniture. Valuable cabinets, rich pianos, were not only hewn to pieces, but bottles of ink, turpentine, oil, whatever would efface or destroy, was employed to defile and to ruin. Horses were ridden into houses. People were forced from their beds to permit the search after hidden treasures. The beautiful homesteads of the parish country, with their wonderful tropical gardens, were ruined. Ancient dwellings of black cypress, 100 years old, which had been reared by the fathers of the Republic, men whose names were famous in Revolutionary history, were given to the torch as recklessly as were the rude hovels, choice pictures and works of art from Europe, select and numerous libraries, objects of peace wholly, were all destroyed. The inhabitants, black no less than white, were left to starve, compelled to feed only upon the garbage to be found in the abandoned camps of the soldiers. The corn scraped up from the spots where the horses fed has been the only means of life left to thousands, but lately in affluence. And thus plundering and burning, the troops made their way through a portion of Beaufort into Barnwell district, where they pursued the same game. The villages of Buford's Bridge, of Barnwell, Blackville, Graham's, Bamberg, Midway, were more or less destroyed, the inhabitants everywhere left homeless and without food. The horses and mules, all cattle and hogs, whenever fit for service or for food, were carried off, and the rest shot. Every implement of the workman or the farmer, tools, plows, hoes, gins, looms, wagons, vehicles, was made to feed the flames. From Barnwell to Orangeburg and Lexington was the next progress, marked everywhere by the same sweeping destruction. Both of these court towns were partially burned. Chapter 5. Doubts and Fears. Fugitives from the Low Country. These tidings duly reached the people of Columbia, and might have prepared them for the treatment they were destined to receive. Daily accessions of fugitives, bringing with them their valuables and provisions, made ample report of the progress of the Federal army. Hundreds of families had seasonably left long before, in anticipation of the danger. Columbia was naturally held to be one of the most secure places of refuge. It was never doubted that this capital city, which contained so many of the manufactures of the Confederate government, the treasury, etc., would be defended from all the concentrated vigor of which the Confederacy was capable, especially, too, as upon the several railroads connected with the city, the army of Lee and the safety of Richmond were absolutely dependent. Young women of family were sent in large numbers to the city, where numbers seemed to promise a degree of security not to be hoped for in any obscure rural abode. The city was accordingly doubled in population, and here was also to be found an accumulation of wealth in plate, jewels, pictures, books, manufactures of art and virtu, not to be estimated, not perhaps to be paralleled in any other town of the Confederacy. In many instances, the accumulations were those of 100 years of successive generations, in the hands of the oldest families of the South. A large proportion of the wealth of Charleston had been stored in the capital city, and the owners of these treasures, in many instances, were unable to effect any farther remove. If apprehensive of the danger, they could only fold their hands, and, hoping against hope, pray for escape from a peril to which they could oppose no farther vigilance or effort. Still, the lurking belief with most persons who apprehended the approach of the Federal army encouraged the faith that, as the city was wholly defenseless, in the event of a summons it would be surrendered upon the usual terms, and that these would necessarily ensure the safety of non-combatants and protect their property. But, in truth, there was no small portion of the inhabitants who denied or doubted, almost to the last moment, that Sherman contemplated any serious demonstration upon the city. They assumed, and this idea was tacitly encouraged, if not believed, by the authorities, military and civil, that the movement on Columbia was but a feint, and that the bulk of his army was preparing for a descent upon Charleston. This also seemed to be the opinion in Charleston itself. Chapter 6. The Federal Army approaching Columbia, skirmishing, Chatham and Stuart expected. All these conjectures were speedily set at rest when, on the 13th February, Monday, the Federal Army was reported to have reached a point in Lexington District, some 10 miles above Jeffcote's. On the 14th, their progress brought them to Tom's Creek, the stream next below Congaree Creek, and about 12 miles below the city. Here the Confederate troops, consisting of the mounted men of Hampton, Wheeler, Butler, etc., made stubborn head against Sherman, holding him in check by constant skirmishing. This skirmishing continued throughout Wednesday, but failed to arrest his progress, and as the Federal cannon continued momently to sound more heavily upon our ears, we were but too certainly assured of the hopelessness of the struggle. The odds of force against the Confederates were too vast for any valor or generalship to make head against it, and yet almost to this moment the hope was held out to the people in many quarters that the city would be saved. It was asserted that the corps of Chatham and Stuart were making forced marches, with the view to a junction with the troops under Beauregard, and such was the spirit of the Confederate troops, and one of the generals, at least, that almost at the moment when Sherman's advance was entering the town, Hampton's cavalry was in order of battle, and only waiting the command to charge it. But the horrors of a street fight in the defenseless city, filled with women and children, were prudently avoided, and the Confederate troops were drawn off from the scene at the very hour when the Federals were entering upon it. But we anticipate. Chapter 7. The Bombardment of Columbia. The city under martial law. Want of transportation. Robberies. Whatever hopes might have been entertained of the ultimate success of our defenses, they were all dissipated when, by daylight on the 16th, Thursday, the Confederate troops re-entered the city, burning the several bridges over the Congaree, the Broad, and Saluda rivers. They were quartered through the day about the streets, and along their several bivouacs they dug slight excavations in the earth, as for rifle pits and for protection from the shells, which fell fast and thick about the town. The shelling commenced the evening before, and continued throughout the night and the next day. No summons for surrender had been made. No warning of any kind was given. New batteries were in rapid progress of erection on the west side of the Congaree, the more effectually to press the work of destruction. The damage was comparatively slight. The new Capitol building was struck 5 times, but suffered little or no injury. Numerous shells fell into the inhabited portions of the town, yet we hear of only 2 persons killed, one on the hospital square, and another near the South Carolina Railroad Depot. The venerable Mr. S.J. Wagner from Charleston, an aged citizen of near 80, narrowly escaped with life, a shell bursting at his feet. His face was excoriated by the fragments, and for a while his eyesight was lost. But we are happy to state that the hurts were slight, and he is now as well as ever. On Wednesday, the 15th, the city was placed under martial law, and the authority confided to General E. M. Law, assisted by Mayor Goodwin and Captains W. B. Stanley and John Mackenzie. With characteristic energy, the officer executed his trusts, and was employed day and night in the maintenance of order. This, with some few exceptions, was surprisingly maintained. There was some riotous conduct after night. Some highway robberies were committed, and several stores broken open and robbed. But beyond these, there were but few incidences of crime and insubordination. Terrible, meanwhile, was the press, the shock, the rush, the hurry, the universal confusion, such as might naturally be looked for in the circumstances of a city from which thousands were preparing to fly, without previous preparations for flight, burdened with pale and trembling women, Their children and portable chattels, trunks and jewels, family Bibles, and the Lars Familiares. The railroad depot for Charlotte was crowded with anxious waiters upon the train, with a wilderness of luggage, millions perhaps in value, much of which was left finally and lost. Throughout Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, these scenes of struggle were in constant performance. The citizens fared badly. The governments of the state and of the Confederacy absorbed all the modes of conveyance. Transportation about the city could not be had save by a rich or favored few. No love could persuade where money failed to convince, and self, growing bloated in its dimensions, stared one from every hurrying aspect as you traversed and excited the crowded streets. In numerous instances, those who succeeded in getting away did so at the cost of trunks and luggage, and under that discomfort they departed. No one who did not see can rapidly conceive. Chapter 8. Evacuation of Columbia by the Confederate troops. Terrible explosion at the South Carolina Railroad Depot. The commissary and quartermaster stores thrown open. The surrender of the city by the mayor. The mayor's letter. Assurances of protection by the federal officers. The end was rapidly approaching. The guns were resounding at the gates. Defense was impossible. At a late hour on Thursday night, the governor, with his suite and a large train of officials, departed. The Confederate Army began its evacuation, and by daylight few remained who were not resigned to the necessity of seeing the tragedy played out. After all the depletion, the city contained, according to our estimate, at least 20,000 inhabitants, the larger proportion being females and children and Negroes. Hampton's cavalry, as we have already mentioned, lingered till near 10 o'clock the next day, and scattered troops of Wheeler's command hovered about the Federal army at their entrance into the town. The inhabitants were startled at daylight on Friday morning by a heavy explosion. This was the South Carolina Railroad Depot. It was accidentally blown up, broken open by a band of plunderers, among whom were many females and Negroes. Their reckless greed precipitated their fate. This building had been made the receptacle of supplies from sundry quarters, and was crowded with stores of merchants and planters, trunks of treasure, innumerable wares and goods of fugitives, all of great value. It appears that, among its contents were some kegs of powder. The plunderers paid, and suddenly, the penalties of their crime. Using their lights freely and hurriedly, the better to pick, they fired a train of powder leading to the kegs. The explosion followed, and the number of persons destroyed is variously estimated, from 17 to 50. It is probable that not more than 35 suffered, but the actual number perishing is unascertained. At an early hour on Friday, the commissary and quartermaster stores were thrown wide, the contents cast out into the streets and given to the people. The Negroes especially loaded themselves with plunder. All this might have been saved had the officers been duly warned by the military authorities of the probable issue of the struggle. Wheeler's cavalry also shared largely of this plunder, and several of them might be seen bearing off huge bales upon their saddles. It was proposed that the white flag should be displayed from the tower of the city hall, but General Hampton, whose command had not yet left the city, and who was still eager to do battle in its defense, indignantly declared that if displayed, he should have it torn down. The following letter from the mayor to General Sherman was the initiation of the surrender. Mayor's Office, Columbia, South Carolina, February 17, 1865. To Major General Sherman. The Confederate forces having evacuated Columbia, I deem it my duty as mayor and representative of the city to ask for its citizens the treatment accorded by the usages of civilized warfare. I therefore respectfully request that you will send a sufficient guard in advance of the army to maintain order in the city and protect the persons and property of the citizens. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, T. J. Goodwin, Mayor. At 9 o'clock on the painfully memorable morning of the 17th of February, Friday, a deputation from the City Council consisting of the mayor, Alderman McKenzie, Bates, and Stork, in a carriage bearing a white flag, proceeded towards the broad River Bridge Road. Arriving at the forks of the Winnsboro Road, they discovered that the Confederate skirmishers were still busy with their guns, playing upon the advance of the Federals. These were the troops of General Wheeler. This conflict was continued simply to afford the main army all possible advantages of a start in their retreat. General Wheeler appraised the deputation that his men would now be withdrawn, and instructed them in what manner to proceed. The deputation met the column of the Federals under Captain Platt, who sent them forward to Colonel Stone, who finally took his seat with them in the carriage. The advance belonged to the 15th Corps. The mayor reports that on surrendering the city to Colonel Stone, the latter assured him of the safety of the citizens and of the protection of their property while under his command. He would not answer for General Sherman, who was in the rear, but he expressed the conviction that he would fully confirm the assurances which he, Colonel Stone, had given. Subsequently, General Sherman did confirm them, and that night, seeing that the mayor was exhausted by his labors of the day, he counseled him to retire to rest, saying, "Not a finger's breadth, Mr. Mayor, of your city shall be harmed. You may lie down to sleep, satisfied that your town shall be as safe in my hands as if wholly in your own." Such was very nearly the language in which he spoke. Such was the substance of it. He added, "It will become my duty to destroy some of the public or government buildings, but I will reserve this performance to another day. It shall be done tomorrow, provided the city be calm." And the mayor retired with this solemnly asserted and repeated assurance. Chapter 9. Occupation of Columbia by the Federal Army. The advance guard fired upon. Plundering private property. The jail fired. Burning cotton. The raid on watches. The convent. Clergymen abused by the soldiers. About 11 o'clock, the head of the column, following the deputation, the flag of the United States surmounting the carriage, reached Market Hall on Main Street, while that of the Corps was carried in the rear. On their way to the city, the carriage was stopped, and the officer was informed that a large body of Confederate cavalry was flanking them. Colonel Stone said to the mayor, "We shall hold you responsible for this." The mayor explained that the road leading to Winnsboro, by which the Confederates were retreating, ran nearly parallel for a short distance with the river road, which accounted for the apparent flanking. Two officers, who arrived in Columbia ahead of the deputation, having crossed the river at a point directly opposite the city, were fired upon by one of Wheeler's cavalry. We are particular in mentioning this fact, as we learn that, subsequently, the incident was urged as a justification of the sack and burning of the city. Hardly had the troops reached the head of Main Street when the work of pillage was begun. Stores were broken open within the first hour after their arrival, with gold, silver, jewels, and liquors eagerly sought. The authorities, officers, soldiers, all seemed to consider it a matter of course, and woe to them who carried a watch with gold chain pendant, or who wore a choice hat or overcoat, or boots or shoes. He was stripped in the twinkling of an eye. It is computed that, from first to last, 1,200 watches were transferred from the pockets of their owners to those of the soldiers. Purses shared the same fate, nor was the Confederate currency repudiated, but of all these things hereafter in more detail. At about 12 o'clock, the jail was discovered to be on fire from within. This building was immediately in rear of the market or city hall, and in a densely built portion of the city. The supposition is that it was fired by some of the prisoners, all of whom were released and subsequently followed the army. The fire of the jail had been preceded by that of some cotton piled in the streets. Both fires were soon subdued by the firemen. At about 1:30 p.m., that of the jail was rekindled and was again extinguished. Some of the prisoners who had been confined at the asylum had made their escape, in some instances, a few days before, and were scattered and protected by citizens. No one felt safe in his own dwelling, and in the faith that General Sherman would respect the convent and have it properly guarded, numbers of young ladies were confined to the care of the Mother Superior, and even trunks of clothes and treasure were sent thither in full confidence that they would find safety. Vain illusions! The Irish Catholic troops, it appears, were not brought into the city at all, were kept on the other side of the river, but a few Catholics were collected among the corps which occupied the city, and of the conduct of these a favorable account is given. One of them rescued a silver goblet of the church, used as a drinking cup by a soldier, and restored it to the Reverend Dr. O'Connell. This priest, by the way, was severely handled by the soldiers. Such also was the fortune of the Reverend Mr. Shand, of Trinity, the Episcopal Church, who sought in vain to save a trunk containing the sacred vessels of his church. It was violently wrested from his keeping, and his struggle to save it only provoked the rougher usage. We are since told that, on reaching Camden, General Sherman restored what he believed were these vessels to Bishop Davis. It has since been discovered that the plate belonged to St. Peter's Church in Charleston. And here it may be well to mention, as suggestive of many clues, an incident which presented a sad commentary on that confidence in the security of the convent, which was entertained by a great portion of the people. This establishment, under the charge of the sister of the Right Reverend Bishop Lynch, was at once a convent and an academy of the highest class. Hither were sent for education the daughters of Protestants, of the most wealthy classes throughout the state, and these, with the nuns, and those young ladies sent thither on the emergency, probably exceeded 100. The Lady Superior herself entertained the fullest confidence in the immunities of the establishment. But her confidence was clouded after she had enjoyed a conference with a certain major of the Yankee army, who described himself as an editor from Detroit. He visited her at an early hour in the day and announced his friendly sympathies with the Lady Superior and the sisterhood, professed his anxiety for their safety, his purpose to do all that he could to ensure it, declared that he would instantly go to Sherman and secure a chosen guard, and altogether made such professions of love and service as to disarm those suspicions which his bad looks and bad manners, inflated speech and pompous carriage might otherwise have provoked. The Lady Superior, with such a charge in her hands, was naturally glad to welcome all shows and prospects of support, and expressing her gratitude, he disappeared and soon after reappeared, bringing with him no less than 8 or 10 men, none of them, as he admitted, being Catholics. He had some specious argument to show that perhaps her guard had better be one of Protestants. This suggestion staggered the lady a little, but he seemed to convey a more potent reason when he added in a whisper, "For I must tell you, my sister, that Columbia is a doomed city." Terrible doom! This officer, leaving his men behind him, disappeared to show himself no more. The guards so left behind were finally among the most busy as plunderers. The moment that their inmates, driven out by the fire, were forced to abandon their house, they began to revel in its contents. Quies custodiet ipsos custodes? Who shall guard the guards? Asks the proverb. In a number of cases, the guards provided for the citizens were among the most active plunderers, were quick to betray their trusts, abandon their posts, and bring their comrades in to join in the general pillage. The most dexterous and adroit of these, it is the opinion of most persons, were chiefly Eastern men, or men of immediate Eastern origin. The Western men, including the Indiana, a portion of the Illinois and Iowa, were neither so dexterous nor unscrupulous, were frequently faithful and respectful, and perhaps it would be safe to assert that many of the houses which escaped the sack and fire owed their safety to the presence or the contiguity of some of these men. But we must retrace our steps. Chapter 10. Firing the city by Sherman's troops. The discipline of the men. Citizens applying for a guard. A reign of terror. The firemen interrupted. A terrible sight. Soldiers burnt to death. The city clock gives its last sound. It must be well to remark that the discipline of the soldiers, upon their first entry into the city, was perfect and most admirable. There was no disorder or irregularity in the line of march, showing that their officers had them completely in hand. They were a fine-looking body of men, mostly young and of vigorous formation, well clad and well shod, seemingly wanting in nothing. Their arms and accoutrements were in bright order. The Negroes accompanying them were not numerous, and seemed mostly to act as drudges and body servants. They groomed horses, waited, carried burdens, and in almost every instance under our eyes appeared in a purely servile and not a military capacity. The men of the West treated them generally with scorn or indifference, sometimes harshly and not unfrequently with blows. But if the entrance into town and while on duty was indicative of admirable drill and discipline, such ceased to be the case the moment the troops were dismissed. Then, whether by tacit permission or direct command, their whole deportment underwent a sudden and rapid change. The Saturnalia soon began. We have shown that the robbery of the persons of the citizens and the plunder of their homes commenced within 1 hour after they had reached the market hall. It continued without interruption throughout the day. Sherman, at the head of his cavalry, traversed the streets everywhere. So did his officers. Subsequently, these officers were everywhere on foot, yet beheld nothing which required the interposition of authority. And yet robbery was going on at every corner, in nearly every house. Citizens generally applied for a guard at their several houses, and for a time these guards were allotted them. These might be faithful or not. In some cases, as already stated, they were, and civil and respectful, considerate of the claims of women, and never trespassing upon the privacy of the family. But in numbers of cases they were intrusive, insulting, and treacherous, leaving no privacy undisturbed, passing without a word into the chambers and prying into every crevice and corner. But the reign of terror did not fairly begin till night. In some instances, where parties complained of the misrule and robbery, their guards said to them with a chuckle, "This is nothing. Wait till tonight, and you'll see hell." Among the first fires at evening was one about dark, which broke out in a filthy purlieu of low houses of wood on Gervais Street, occupied mostly as brothels. Almost at the same time, a body of the soldiers scattered over the eastern outskirts of the city fired severally the dwellings of Mr. Secretary Trenholm, General Wade Hampton, Dr. John Wallace, J.U. Adams, Mrs. Stark, Mr. Latta, Mrs. English, and many others. There were then some 20 fires in full blast, in as many different quarters, and while the alarm sounded from these quarters, a similar alarm was sent up almost simultaneously from Cotton Town, the northernmost limit of the city, and from Main Street in its very center, at the several stores or houses of O. Z. Bates, C. D. Eberhart, and some others, in the heart of the most densely settled portion of the town, thus enveloping in flames almost every section of the devoted city. At this period, thus early in the evening, there were few shops of that drunkenness which prevailed at a late hour of the night, and only after all the grocery shops on Main Street had been rifled. The men engaged in this work were well prepared with all the appliances essential to their work. They did not need the torch. They carried with them from house to house pots and vessels containing combustible liquids, composed probably of phosphorus and other similar agents, turpentine, etc., and with balls of cotton saturated in this liquid, with which they also overspread floors and walls. They conveyed the flames with wonderful rapidity from dwelling to dwelling. Each had his ready box of lucifer matches, and with a scrape upon the walls, the flames began to rage. Where houses were closely contiguous, a brand from one was a means of conveying destruction to the other. The winds favored. They had been high throughout the day, and steadily prevailed from southwest by west, and bore the flames eastward. To this fact we owe the preservation of the portions of the city lying west of Assembly Street. The work, begun thus vigorously, went on without impediment, and with hourly increase throughout the night. Engines and hose were brought out by the firemen, but these were soon driven from their labors, which were indeed idle against such a storm of fire, by the pernicious hostility of the soldiers. The hose was hewn to pieces, and the firemen, dreading worse usage to themselves, left the field in despair. Meanwhile the flames spread from side to side, from front to rear, from street to street, and where their natural and inevitable progress was too slow for those who had kindled them, they helped them on by the application of fresh combustibles and more rapid agencies of conflagration. By midnight, Main Street, from its northern to its southern extremity, was a solid wall of fire. By 12 o'clock, the great blocks, which included the banking houses and the treasury buildings, were consumed. Janney's, Congaree, and Nickerson's hotels, the magnificent manufactories of Evans and Cogswell, indeed, every large block in the business portion of the city, the old Capitol and all the adjacent buildings were in ruins. The range called the Granite was beginning to flame at 12, and might have been saved by 10 vigorous men, resolutely working. At 1 o'clock, the hour was struck by the clock in the market hall, which was even then illuminated from within. It was its own last hour which it sounded, and its tongue was silenced forevermore. In less than 5 minutes after, its spire went down with a crash, and by this time almost all the buildings within the precinct were a mass of ruins. Very grand and terrible, beyond description, was the awful spectacle. It was a scene for the painter of the terrible. It was the blending of a range of burning mountains stretched in a continuous series of more than a mile. Here was Etna, sending up its spouts of flaming lava, Vesuvius, Immolius of like display, shooting up with loftier torrents, and Stromboli, struggling with awful throes to shame both by its superior volumes of fluid flame. The winds were tributary to these convulsive efforts, and tossed the volcanic torrents of sulphurous cloud, wreaths of sable, edged with sheeted lightnings, wrapped the skies, and at short intervals the falling tower and the tottering wall, avalanche-like, went down with thunderous sound, sending up at every crash great billowy showers of glowing fiery embers. Throughout the whole of this terrible scene, the soldiers continued their search after spoil. The houses were severally and soon gutted of their contents. Hundreds of iron safes, warranted impenetrable to fire and the burglar, it was soon satisfactorily demonstrated, were not Yankee-proof. They were split open and robbed, yielding in some cases very largely of Confederate money and bonds, if not of gold and silver. Jewelry and plate in abundance was found. Men could be seen staggering off with huge waiters, vases, candelabra, to say nothing of cups, goblets, and smaller vessels, all of solid silver. Clothes and shoes, when new, were appropriated, the rest left to burn. Liquors were drunk with such avidity as to astonish the veteran bacchanals of Columbia, nor did the parties thus distinguishing themselves hesitate about the vintage. There was no idle discrimination in the matter of taste. From that vulgar liquor which Judge Burke used to say always provoked within him an inordinate propensity to stale, to the choicest red wines of ancient cellars. In one vault on Main Street, 17 casks of wine were stored away, which, an eyewitness tells us, barely sufficed, once broken into, for the draughts of a single hour. Such were the appetites at work and the numbers in possession of them. Rye, corn, claret, and Madeira all found their way into the same channels, and we were not to wonder when told that no less than 150 of the drunken creatures perished miserably among the flames kindled by their own comrades, and from which they were unable to escape. The estimate will not be thought extravagant by those who saw the condition of hundreds after 1 o'clock a.m. By others, however, the estimate is reduced to 30, but the number will never be known. Sherman's officers themselves are reported to have said that they lost more men in the sack and burning of the city, including certain explosions, than in all their fights while approaching it. It is also suggested that the orders which Sherman issued at daylight on Saturday morning for the arrest of the fire were issued in consequence of the loss of men which he had thus sustained. One or more of his men were shot by parties unknown in some dark passages or alleys. It is supposed in consequence of some attempted outrages which humanity could not endure, the assassin taking advantage of the obscurity of the situation and adroitly mingling with the crowd without. And while these scenes were at their worst, while the flames were at their highest and most extensively raging, groups might be seen at the several corners of the streets, drinking, roaring, reveling, while the fiddle and accordion were playing their popular airs among them. There was no cessation of the work till 5 a.m. on Saturday. Chapter 11. Unsuccessful attempts to save property. Females ill-treated. A guard performs his duty. A plucky citizen. Families quartered in the streets. A cool proceeding. A big drunk. A single thought will suffice to show that the owners or lodgers in the houses thus sacrificed were not silent or quiet spectators of the conflagration, which threw them naked and homeless under the skies of night. The male population, consisting mostly of aged men, invalids, decrepids, women and children, were not capable of very active or powerful exertions, but they did not succumb to the fate without earnest pleas and strenuous efforts. Old men and women and children were to be seen, even while the flames were rolling and raging around them, while walls were cracking and rafters tottering and tumbling, in the endeavor to save their clothing and some of their most valuable effects. It was not often that they were suffered to succeed. They were driven out headlong. Ladies were hustled from their chambers, their ornaments plucked from their persons, their bundles from their hands. It was in vain that the mother appealed for the garments of her children. They were torn from her grasp and hurled into the flames. The young girl, striving to save a single frock, had it rent to fibers in her grasp. Men and women bearing off their trunks were seized, despoiled. In a moment the trunk burst asunder with the stroke of an axe or gun butt. The contents laid bare, rifled of all the objects of desire, and the residue sacrificed to the fire. You might see the ruined owner, standing woe-begone, aghast, gazing at his tumbling dwelling, his scattered property, with a dumb agony in his face that was inexpressibly touching. Others you might hear, as we did, with wild blasphemies, assailing the justice of heaven, or invoking, with lifted and clenched hands, the fiery wrath of the avenger. But the soldiers plundered and drank. The fiery work raged, and the moon sailed over all with as serene an aspect as when she first smiled upon the ark resting against the slopes of Ararat. Such was the spectacle for hours on the chief business street of Columbia. We have intimated that, at an early hour of the day, almost every house was visited by groups averaging in number from 2 to 6 persons. Some of these entered civilly enough, but pertinaciously entered, in some cases, begging for milk, eggs, bread, and meat, in most cases demanding them. The kitchens were entered frequently by one party while another penetrated the dwelling, and the cook was frequently astounded by the audacity by which the turkey, duck, fowl, or roast was transferred from the spit to the wallet of the soldier. In the house, parties less meek of temper than these pushed their way, and the first intimation of their presence, as they were confronted at the entrance, was a pistol clapped at the head or bosom of the owner, whether male or female. "Your watch, your money," was the demand. Frequently no demand was made. Rarely indeed was a word spoken where the watch or chain or ring or bracelet presented itself conspicuously to the eye. It was incontinently plucked away from the neck, breast, or bosom. Hundreds of women, still greater numbers of old men, were thus despoiled. The slightest show of resistance provoked violence to the person. The venerable Mr. Alfred Hugie was thus robbed in the chamber and presence of his family, and in the eye of an almost dying wife. He offered resistance, and was collared and dispossessed by violence. We are told that the venerable ex-senator, Colonel Arthur P. Hayne, was treated even more roughly. Mr. James Rose, besides his watch, lost largely of choice wines, which had been confided to his keeping. But we cannot descend to examples. In the open streets the pickpockets were mostly active. A frequent mode of operating was by first asking you the hour. If thoughtless enough to reply, producing the watch or indicating its possession, it was quietly taken from hand or pocket and transferred to the pocket of the other gentleman with some such remark as this: "A pretty little watch, that. I'll take it myself, it just suits me." And the appropriation followed. And if you hinted any dislike to the proceeding, a grasp was taken of your collar and the muzzle of a revolver put in your ear. Some of the incidents connected with this wholesale system were rather amusing. Dr. Templeton, a well-known and highly esteemed citizen, passing along the street, was accosted by a couple of these experts, who stopped and asked him, pointing to the Arsenal building on the hill opposite, "What building is that?" "The State Arsenal," was his reply, unwisely extending his arm as he pointed, in turn to the building, and revealing between the folds of his coat the shining links of a rich gold chain. Before he could recover himself, his chain and watch were in the grasp of the thief, who was preparing to transfer it to his own pocket, quietly remarking, "A very pretty little watch, just to my liking." "That is very cool," said Templeton. "Just my way," said the fellow, walking off. "Stop," said Templeton, half amazed at the coolness of the proceeding, and feeling that he had only to put the best face on the matter. "Stop. That watch will be of no use to you without the key. Won't you take that also?" "All right," replied the robber, returning and receiving the key. The question, "What's o'clock?" was the sure forerunner of an attempt upon your pocket. Some parties saved their chronometers by an adroitness which deserves to be made known. One individual replied to the question, "You are too late, my good fellows. I was asked that question already by one of your parties at the other corner." He left them to infer that the watch was already gone, and they passed him by. We are told of one person who, being thus asked for the time of day by three of them, in the street, in which he could see no other of their comrades, thrust a revolver suddenly into their faces, and cocking it quickly, cried out, "Look for yourselves!" They sheered off and left him. We ourselves were twice asked the question the morning after the fire, and looking innocently to where the city hall clock once stood, replied, "Our city clock is gone, you see, but it must be near 11. Mr. J.K. Robinson was assailed by the same question by a party in the neighborhood of his house. He denied that he had a watch. "Oh, look, look," was the answer of the questioner. "I need not look," quoth Robinson, "since I have not a watch." "Look, look, a man of your appearance must own a watch." "Well, I do, but it is at my home, at my house." "Where's your house?" "We'll go and see." He took them into his house, suddenly called his guard, and said, "These men are pursuing me. I know not what they want." The guard drove out the party, with successive thrusts at them of the bayonet, and from the street, defrauded of their spoils, they saluted house, guard, and owner with all manner of horrid execrations. Hundreds of like anecdotes are told, not merely of loss in watches, but of every other article of property, hats and boots, overcoats and shawls. These, when new and attractive, were sure to be taken. Even the negroes were despoiled, whenever the commodity was of any value. An incident occurred which, though amusing to read of, could not have been very pleasant to one of the party engaged at least. A gentleman was directed to break in the heads and empty the contents of some 40 barrels of whiskey stored at the fairgrounds. He had proceeded with the job only so far as breaking in the heads of the barrels, when a number of soldiers entered the building and stopped all further proceeding. They charged him with poisoning the liquor, and forced him to take a drink from every barrel, before they would touch the contents. The consequence was that he was drunk for over a week.